There's something about a late-night stage that carries both charm and danger. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Another star, another story, another round of laughs. But when the words Sylvester Stallone flashed across the studio monitors, something in the air shifted. The crowd straightened, their applause echoing like the memory of an era that refused to fade. Jimmy Kimmel stood center stage, all smiles and rhythm, his cue cards fanned like a magician's deck. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice gliding through the applause, "our next guest is a legend, a man who turned underdogs into champions and mumbling into box office gold. Please welcome the one and only Sylvester Stallone." The band kicked into a jazzy riff that nodded to Eye of the Tiger. The audience roared, and from behind the curtain, Stallone appeared, steady, composed, timeless. He walked with that unmistakable Stallone gait, shoulders broad, chin tilted slightly down, eyes scanning the room like a boxer sizing up the crowd. He wasn't rushing. Every step felt deliberate, like a man used to walking through both adoration and doubt. Dressed in a dark navy blazer, open collar, no tie, he looked like the embodiment of calm authority. His hair, silver now, caught the studio lights. He smiled faintly, not wide like an entertainer, but measured like a man who's learned when to show his cards. Jimmy extended his hand. "Good to have you." Stallone shook it firmly. "Good to be here, Jimmy." They both sat today. Applause faded. Cameras adjusted. The familiar rhythm of the Jimmy Kimmel show began its dance. "So, Stallone," Jimmy started, tapping his cue cards with mock enthusiasm. "You've done it again. Another movie. Another comeback. At this point, I feel like you're in competition with time itself." The audience laughed. Stallone smiled politely. "Time's undefeated," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the laughter. "But I like to make it work for me." Jimmy chuckled. "That's deep. You sure you didn't steal that from one of your characters?" A few people laughed harder than they should have. Stallone didn't. "No," he said, "those characters stole it from me." The line hit clean, the crowd clapping instinctively. Jimmy smiled, brushing it off. "Fair enough. But tell me, do you ever get tired of being the tough guy? I mean, you've punched everything from communism to father issues on screen. Ever think about a rom-com?" A ripple of laughter. Stallone tilted his head. "Life's already a fight, Jimmy. I don't need to fake it." The laughter softened. The tone shifted just a notch. Jimmy grinned, sensing the edge but pressing on. "Fair enough. But it's interesting. Every generation has its action star, right? These days we've got superheroes, green screens, CGI. You ever feel out of place?" The question hovered. Stallone looked out toward the audience, then back at Jimmy. "I feel like the world's gotten soft," he said evenly. "When I started, you had to bleed to get people to believe you. Now they just add the bruises in post." The audience murmured approval. Jimmy raised his eyebrows, smiling like a man walking the edge of a blade. "So, no Marvel cameo then?" Stallone smirked faintly. "They can keep their capes. I had one once. It was called Rambo's bandana." The laughter returned, brief but genuine. For a moment, things felt normal. Safe. But safety on live television never lasts long. Jimmy glanced at his next cue card, and a familiar mischievous grin crept back. "So, I heard you've got a new film, another story about redemption, courage, survival. Sound familiar?" Stallone's gaze lifted slightly. "Good themes never expire." "Right," Jimmy said, leaning in. "But do you ever worry people will say you're repeating yourself? Same tone, same look, same guy punching his way through a metaphor." The crowd gave a nervous chuckle. Stallone's smile thinned. "When you spend 50 years climbing mountains, you stop asking if the view looks familiar." Applause broke out again, hesitant, respectful. Jimmy grinned, pretending to clap along. "That's poetic," he said lightly. "Did Rocky teach you that? Or Rambo?" This time, no one laughed. Stallone's eyes didn't move. "Funny," he said quietly. "I thought comedy was supposed to make people laugh, not flinch." It landed. Subtle, but sharp. The audience shifted in their seats. Jimmy held his smile, but his posture stiffened slightly. "Just having fun, Sly." Don't go all first blood on me. I only hit back, Stallone said, voice calm. Even in interviews. The tension wrapped around the room like invisible wire. The band stayed still. The audience froze, unsure if this was still part of the act. Jimmy laughed awkwardly. All right, let's rewind. Let's talk Rocky. You wrote that script in, what, 3 days? 3 days, yeah, Stallone nodded. That's fast, Jimmy said, mock impressed. Did you run out of crayons? A sharp laugh from somewhere in the back of the audience. The rest didn't follow. Stallone's face didn't move. I wrote it on paper I couldn't afford, he said slowly, while sleeping in a bus terminal, trying to sell my dog to eat. So, no crayons, Jimmy. Just hunger. The audience went silent. Completely silent. Jimmy blinked, realizing the misstep. Oh, wow. That's, heavy, he stammered, chuckling nervously. Didn't mean to, Stallone leaned forward, his voice steady but ice-cold. Sometimes, Jimmy, you crack jokes. Sometimes, you crack dignity. Be careful which one you're breaking tonight. The crowd let out a collective exhale, a mix of awe, shock, and respect. Jimmy forced a smile, adjusting his cards. Well, folks, he said weakly, that's Stallone for you. Still punching. Only when it's worth it, Stallone replied quietly. The band played the next cue softly, trying to lighten the air. But the tone had changed, and everyone knew it. What began as banter was turning into something else. A collision between a man who earned his respect the hard way and another who didn't realize he was about to lose his. And this was only the beginning. The energy in the studio had shifted. You could feel it even through the camera lens. That invisible, electric tension when laughter turns brittle. The applause sign blinked red, but even the audience seemed hesitant to obey it. Stallone sat still, composed, a monument of restraint. Jimmy Kimmel, on the other hand, shifted in his chair with the practiced unease of a man who'd just realized the punchline might have been himself. All right, Jimmy said, forcing a chuckle. No crayons, got it. Just blood, sweat, and tears. Real method writing. The joke hung there, limp. A few polite laughs trickled through the crowd, but they weren't laughing with him anymore. They were watching him try. Stallone leaned back slightly, folding his hands. His gaze didn't waver. You know, he said calmly, I think it's easy to make light of things you never had to live through. The crowd murmured. Jimmy's grin flickered. Hey, come on. I'm not making light of it. I'm just, keeping it light. It's a comedy show. Yeah, Stallone said. Sometimes the problem is people forget that comedy still needs truth. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. It was subtle, but the momentum, that invisible rhythm between host and guest, was gone. Stallone had seized it. For a man who'd spent his life fighting fictional battles, this one felt all too real. Jimmy shuffled his cue cards, desperate to steer back to control. All right, let's, talk about the new movie. What's it called again? The Redeemer. The Redeemer, Stallone confirmed. It's about a veteran trying to find peace after war. Something real. Something people carry inside them for decades. Jimmy smiled, but there was an edge to it now. Another tough guy role. You and redemption. You're inseparable. Maybe because both come from the same place, Stallone said. Failure first, then the climb back. The audience clapped softly. Jimmy let them, but his grin didn't quite hold. That's beautiful, man, he said, feigning warmth. But don't you ever worry that people see your movies as, I don't know, outdated? I mean, the lone wolf hero thing. It's kind of a relic, right? The crowd gave a low, nervous hum. Stallone didn't blink. You think fighting for something real is outdated? Jimmy smirked, half shrugging. I think maybe it's overdone. These days, people want superheroes, multiverse, CGI explosions. You know, stuff where the good guy doesn't have wrinkles. That got a laugh, but not the kind Jimmy wanted. It sounded forced, a reflex from a crowd that knew they were watching a live grenade roll across the stage. Stallone's lips curled into a faint, dangerous smile. Wrinkles show you lived long enough to learn something. Some people confuse that with being irrelevant. The audience clapped louder now. Stallone wasn't just defending himself. He was performing, but without trying. Every line sounded grounded, lived in, earned. Jimmy's own show was slipping through his fingers. He forced another laugh, tapping his pen on the desk. Okay, you've still got it. I'll give you that. I never lost it, Stallone said quietly. The crowd erupted again. Laughter, applause, even a few whistles. Jimmy's expression froze mid-smile. Then he looked down, pretending to read his next question. Well, he said after a pause, it's good that you've still got that fighting spirit. You've made, what, 10 Rocky films, 7 Rambos. At this point, you've probably punched more people than the lapped. The audience laughed again, the kind of uneasy laughter that comes from people trying to diffuse the tension themselves. Stallone just stared at him. You really think those movies were about punching? Jimmy blinked, caught off guard. Weren't they? Stallone leaned forward slightly. They were about survival. About what happens when the world tells you you're done and you get up anyway. But I guess that's hard to understand when your toughest fight is keeping your ratings up. That landed like a right hook. The audience gasped. Then, a few beats later, applauded. Jimmy laughed awkwardly, shaking his head. You're good, Sly. You're really good. Maybe too serious, but good. Or maybe, Stallone said, voice low but calm. I just don't mistake mockery for humor. The applause grew again, real this time. Not polite, not nervous, the kind that carries weight. The look on Jimmy's face faltered. The polished, easy confidence of a man used to controlling the room started to crack. He smiled through it, but his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of unease behind the charm. Come on, he said, leaning back. It's the Jimmy Kimmel show, man. We joke. We have fun. You're taking this too seriously. Maybe, Stallone said softly, you're not taking anything seriously enough. The audience went silent again. For a moment, all you could hear was the hum of the studio lights and the faint creak of Jimmy's chair. Stallone's gaze held steady, not angry, just firm. The kind of look that said he'd spent his whole life dealing with people who didn't understand where the lines were. Jimmy shifted again, trying to break the stare. All right, let's not get too deep here, he said quickly, flipping to his next card. So, speaking of old-school toughness, you still do your own stunts, right? Stallone nodded once. Most of them. Why? Jimmy asked. You trying to prove something? Or is it just hard to let go? Another chuckle rippled through the audience. I do them, Stallone said, because when someone pays to watch me bleed on screen, they deserve to know it's real. The crowd burst into applause. It wasn't loud, it was long. A slow, echoing affirmation of respect. Jimmy swallowed, his smirk faltering for good this time. You know, that's kinda intense. Stallone shrugged. Real things usually are. The applause continued. Jimmy let it. He didn't have a choice. When it finally died down, he forced another grin, glancing at the camera. Well, folks, looks like we're getting the full Stallone experience tonight. Passion, pain, and punches you can't see coming. Stallone smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on him, and all without a script. Jimmy exhaled sharply through his nose, pretending to laugh. Guess I should have worn gloves for this one. Stallone leaned back, crossing his arms. Doesn't help if you keep swinging below the belt. That line hit the room like thunder. The audience gasped, then cheered, half in disbelief, half in awe. The band hesitated before playing the outro cue, unsure whether to cut or keep rolling. Jimmy forced a grin so tight it looked painful. We'll be right back after this short break, he said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. The cameras panned out, capturing the two men sitting side by side. One smiling with the confidence of a survivor, the other smiling because it was all he had left. As the red light on the camera faded to black, you could almost feel it. The battle lines had been drawn. And when the show came back from commercial, no one, not even Jimmy Kimmel, knew what was coming next. The commercial break lasted 90 seconds. 90 seconds of silence, tension, and invisible stays. Jimmy's crew moved nervously, adjusting microphones, brushing powder on foreheads that didn't need it. The band pretended to tune instruments, but no one played a note. The air felt thick enough to chew. Stallone sat quietly, hands clasped, his expression unreadable. The old warrior calm. Jimmy, on the other hand, shifted in his seat, rehearsing the easy grin he'd worn 1,000 times before. But this time it didn't fit. The control he usually commanded, gone. The laughter that once danced at his fingertips, vanished. When the countdown hit 3, the red light blinked back on. The cameras rolled, and the entire nation tuned into a powder keg. "Welcome back," Jimmy said, forcing brightness into his tone. "We're here with the one and only Sylvester Stallone. Rocky, Rambo, legend, and clearly a man who can still throw verbal punches." The audience gave a hesitant laugh. A few clapped. Most just watched, waiting. Stallone smiled faintly, a small curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Only when someone swings first. The line landed softly, but the echo it left was thunder. Jimmy chuckled tightly. "Hey, that's fair. I'm just trying to keep up. You know, not every day I get to sit across from the guy who practically built the word grit." "Yeah," Stallone said calmly. "Grit usually comes after you've been stepped on a few times." Jimmy blinked, unsure how to follow that. He shuffled his cards, pretending to check his notes. "So," he said, "let's pivot. You played a lot of tough guys who get knocked down and get back up again. But let's be honest, Sly, in real life, you had your fair share of flops too, right? Movies that didn't land, critics who said you were washed up. What keeps you going after all that?" It was meant to sound curious. It sounded like a challenge. Stallone leaned back, letting the question hang between them like smoke. "What keeps me going," he said finally, "is knowing that the same people who doubt you today will quote you tomorrow." A ripple of applause. But Jimmy pushed again. "Sure," he said, forcing a grin. "But not everyone gets to have that kind of comeback. Some people say you only survived because you kept recycling the same character. Rocky, Rambo, Creed, it's all one guy with a new haircut, right?" The crowd gasped. It wasn't funny anymore. Stallone didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, voice low and steady. "That one guy, as you call him, represents more heart than half this industry combined. He's a factory worker who keeps clocking in when his hands hurt. He's a soldier who comes home and still fights the nightmares. He's everyone who got told no and got up anyway." The room was silent. Even Jimmy's band stopped fidgeting. Stallone's voice deepened. "You don't mock that, Jimmy. You respect it." The applause this time was loud, spontaneous, real, and long. Jimmy smiled weakly, nodding as if he'd somehow planned this. Okay, fair," he said quickly, his voice tight. "You've definitely earned that speech. But come on, some of those sequels. You've made more comebacks than a broken yo-yo." A few chuckles from the back rows, but they didn't carry. Stallone's stayed fixed. "You call them comebacks," he said slowly. "I call them proof that I never stopped trying. Some people only get one shot at life, Jimmy. I've spent mine showing what happens when you don't waste it." Jimmy shifted again, the grin faltering. "All right," he said, feigning playfulness. "But let's be real, Sly. You've got the fame, the money, the mansions. Are you still really that guy from Philly? Or are you just playing him on camera now?" That hit something. The temperature dropped. Stallone's smile faded. "You think money changes where you came from?" Jimmy shrugged. "I think it changes perspective." Stallone nodded slowly. "Yeah, perspective. You start seeing who's real and who's hiding behind the laugh track." The crowd murmured. Jimmy tried to recover, but Stallone wasn't done. His voice grew firmer, heavier with quiet authority. "You see, I don't need to prove where I came from. My story's written in callous, not cue cards. I've been broke, hungry, homeless. I've seen what happens when the world stops clapping. You find out who you are when no one's watching." The audience was silent again, every word hitting like a drumbeat. Jimmy smiled tightly, but his eyes darted toward the crew, searching for a lifeline. There wasn't one. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, It's a good thing the world's watching now. Oh. Stallone's gaze didn't waver. Yeah, he said. The world's watching a man still standing, not a host hiding behind cheap shots. The audience gasped. The sound was sharp, collective. Like everyone realized at once that they'd crossed the point of no return. Jimmy froze, then forced a chuckle. Oh, come on, that's not fair. I'm just asking what everyone wants to know. No, Stallone said quietly. You're saying what everyone's too afraid to own up to, that tearing people down has become easier than respecting what they built. A pause, a heartbeat. Then the audience erupted. Not laughter, applause. Loud, long, defiant applause. Stallone didn't smile. He just sat there, calm, grounded, unshaken. A man who'd been underestimated too many times to care anymore. Jimmy fidgeted, tapping his pen against the desk like a nervous tick. Well, I got to say, Sly, he said finally, his voice strained. You've got away with words. Maybe you should have hosted the show tonight. Maybe I just showed up to remind you what words can do when they mean something, Stallone said softly. The applause surged again, this time even louder. Jimmy's fake grin broke completely. He leaned back, trying to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow. Man, you're intense. You take this stuff personally. Respect is personal, Stallone said, especially when you've had to fight for it. That line hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jimmy exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You really don't let anything slide, huh? Not when it's aimed at the people I represent. And who's that, exactly? Jimmy asked, crossing his arms. Stallone didn't hesitate. Everyone who ever got laughed at before they got listened to. The room exploded. Applause, cheers, even shouts from the back rows. The crew exchanged glances. No one had ever seen anything like this on Kimmel's set. Jimmy forced a laugh, but his eyes had gone cold. Well, he said slowly, I guess I hit a nerve. No, Stallone said, leaning forward. You hit a truth. The music cue for commercial began faintly, the showrunner waving from behind the camera to cut it there. But Jimmy didn't call the break. He leaned closer instead, his voice lower, his words tighter. You know, Sly, I've got nothing but respect for what you've done. But let's not pretend you're still the underdog. You've been Hollywood royalty for decades. You don't get to play victim anymore. That did it. Stallone's eyes hardened. I'm not playing victim, he said, his tone grave. I'm standing up for the people who don't have your microphone. The audience roared in approval. Jimmy blinked, rattled now. For the first time, he looked like the guest on his own show. And somewhere in that red-lit studio, you could feel it, that invisible, irreversible shift. The host had lost control. The fighter had taken over. The cameras were still rolling, but everyone in the room already knew. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. The red light above the camera stayed on. The applause had faded, but the tension hadn't. It hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, hot, thick, and impossible to ignore. Jimmy leaned forward now, his cue cards forgotten, a smirk plastered on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. Stallone sat across from him, unmoving, hands clasped, gaze steady, the kind of silence that made people nervous. The crowd didn't dare whisper. They could feel it. Something real was happening. Jimmy finally broke the stillness. So, Sly, he said, voice casual but edged, you've always had this whole thing about being the underdog, the fighter, the man of the people. But let's be honest, you're not exactly struggling these days, are you? A few chuckles from the audience, uncertain, forced. Stallone tilted his head slightly. Success doesn't erase struggle, Jimmy. It just means you survived it. Sure, Jimmy said quickly. But it's easy to talk about survival from a Beverly Hills mansion, isn't it? He grinned. The crowd laughed nervously again. Stallone's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. You know, it's funny, he said. People love to see you rise, right up until you rise higher than their comfort zone. The audience murmured, unsure whether to clap or hold their breath. Jimmy raised his eyebrows. You're saying I'm uncomfortable with your success. I'm saying you sound like a guy who forgot what respect looks like, Stallone replied evenly. Jimmy's smile faltered. He leaned back, trying to reclaim the upper hand. Come on, Sly. You're taking this way too seriously. It's the Jimmy Kimmel show, not a therapy session. That's exactly the problem, Stallone said quietly. You think everything's a joke, even people's lives. A hush fell. Even the band stopped moving. Jimmy cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. I think you're giving me a little too much credit there, champ. I'm just doing my job, asking questions people actually want to hear. Then ask something real, Stallone said. His tone was calm, almost weary. Not something you think will trend for 15 seconds. That landed. The audience gasped softly, and a few people even clapped before realizing they probably shouldn't. Jimmy's grin stiffened. You really think I'm here chasing clicks? I've been doing this for decades. Then maybe you should have learned when to stop punching down, Stallone shot back. The laughter died completely. The studio was silent now, the kind of silence that carries weight. Jimmy shifted, crossing his legs, trying to appear unfazed. You know, you sound exactly like your characters right now, all righteous and brooding. You sure you're not still in character? Stallone's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. No, Jimmy, I'm just not pretending. The crowd oohed. Jimmy looked genuinely irritated now. All right, fine. You want real? Let's talk real. You've had controversies too, right? Not everything in your life is a movie montage and a training sequence. There were mistakes, weren't there? The air went razor-sharp. Everyone froze. Stallone's jaw clenched. His fingers curled slightly on the armrest. Be careful, he said, his voice dropping an octave. There's a difference between honesty and cheap shots. Jimmy leaned forward, the predator grin returning. No cheap shots, just questions. That's my job. I mean, people still talk about your temper, your divorces, the fights on set. Are those just ghosts of the past, or are you still punching your way through them? The audience gasped again. It was no longer an interview. It was an ambush. Stallone exhaled slowly through his nose, his gaze locked on Jimmy like a man studying his opponent. You really don't know when to stop, do you? I'm just saying what people are thinking, Jimmy said quickly, shrugging. You've been this larger-than-life hero for decades. But maybe the audience deserves to know the man behind the muscles. The audience deserves better than to watch you tear someone down for ratings, Stallone replied sharply. That one hit. Jimmy blinked, his smile vanishing for the first time. Stallone leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying that unmistakable weight of authority. You sit in that chair and act like you're above everyone. But deep down, you're afraid that the people you mock might actually be stronger than you. A few audience members began to clap, unsure if it was the right moment. The rest stayed completely still, eyes flicking between the two men like a tennis match where one player didn't realize he was losing. Jimmy tried to recover. Okay, that's a nice speech, Sly. You sound like you're pitching another Rocky sequel. I sound like someone who's had enough, Stallone said. The words dropped like a hammer. The room went still again. Jimmy swallowed hard. Enough of what? Of people like you, Stallone said flatly. People who confuse mockery with conversation. You hide behind jokes because you're afraid to actually feel something real. Jimmy's jaw tightened. You think you're better than me? No, Stallone said calmly. Just quieter. It was devastating. The crowd gasped again, some even laughing in disbelief. Jimmy forced a smirk, though his voice betrayed the tension. Man, you really can't take a joke, huh? Stallone's tone turned almost sorrowful. You really can't tell one that means anything. That line shattered the room. The audience erupted. Claps, cheers, shouts. The kind of spontaneous support that only happens when truth cuts through performance. Jimmy blinked, overwhelmed. For the first time that night, he looked small, not because Stallone towered over him physically, but because the weight of authenticity had shifted the entire stage. The host's face twitched into something that looked like anger. All right, he said sharply. If you think I'm such a bad guy, why even come on my show? Stallone stood now, slowly, deliberately. The movement itself was cinematic. I came here, he said, because I thought maybe there was still room for real talk on late-night television. I was wrong. The crowd gasped again. A wave of murmurs swept through the studio. Jimmy rose too, desperate to control the optics, his smile plastered on like a shield. "Oh, come on," he said loudly, gesturing toward the cameras. "Don't be dramatic, Sly. Sit down. We're just talking." "No," Stallone said simply. "You're talking. I was listening, but not anymore." The audience burst into a mix of applause and disbelief, some cheering, some frozen. Jimmy's face went pale. He tried one last jab. "What's the matter, champ? Can't handle a few questions?" Stallone toned, his voice low but commanding. "Questions build understanding. You weren't asking questions, Jimmy. You were taking swings." He paused at the edge of the stage, the spotlight catching his profile, a silhouette of calm defiance. Jimmy muttered something into the mic, trying to pull a joke back into the chaos. "Guess we'll call that a TKO." Stallone looked back, his expression unflinching. "No, that was a walk-off." The crowd exploded. Some leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. Others just stayed, stunned. Jimmy froze at his desk, his grin gone, the show unraveling in real time. As Stallone disappeared behind the curtain, the cameras tried to follow, but the feed cut abruptly back to Jimmy's face. He stared at the audience, then forced a laugh that echoed hollowly through the stunned studio. "Well," he said weakly, "guess the Italian stallion still got one heck of a right hook." But no one laughed. For a few stunned seconds, the studio hung in silence, that strange, heavy quiet that comes after a storm. The cameras were still rolling, the red lights still burning, but no one quite knew what to do. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just sat there, suspended between shock and awe. Jimmy Kimmel remained behind his desk, his grin faltering like a candle losing its flame. His cue cards were scattered, forgotten. The applause sign above the stage blinked helplessly, trying to cue a reaction that wasn't coming. Someone backstage finally realized what had happened and cut to commercial. The theme music played, but it sounded hollow now, upbeat horns echoing over a room full of wide eyes. Behind the curtain, Sylvester Stallone kept walking. Slow, steady, each step a punctuation mark in a sentence that had already been written in silence. The crew parted as he passed, their faces a collage of shock, admiration, and disbelief. A young camera operator, barely in his 20s, whispered under his breath, "That was legendary." Stallone didn't turn. He didn't need to. The set lights still shimmered faintly on his shoulders as he disappeared down the corridor. Back on stage, Jimmy fumbled through his notes as if pretending the last 5 minutes hadn't happened could somehow make it true. He forced a smile for the camera when they came back from break. "Well," he said with a shaky laugh, "that went well. Remind me never to box with the real Rocky, huh?" A few audience members chuckled weakly, grateful for something to break the tension, but most just exchanged uneasy looks. Something had shifted. You could feel it. It wasn't a walkout, it was a statement. The rest of the show limped on. Guests smiled too tightly. Jokes landed too softly. And every few minutes, Jimmy's gaze darted toward the spot where Stallone had stood, the empty chair glowing beneath the studio lights like a ghost of the man who just filled it. When the broadcast ended, producers scrambled. The director barked questions through his headset. "Do we cut that part? Do we keep it?" Another voice replied nervously, "We can't cut it. It's already trending." Because while Jimmy tried to move on, the internet hadn't. A studio intern, sitting cross-legged beside a tangle of cables, was already watching it unfold live online. A shaky clip filmed by an audience member had hit Twitter less than 2 minutes after Stallone walked off. The caption read, "Stallone just walked out on Jimmy Kimmel. This man has zero patience for disrespect, explosion symbol fire #respectly #Kimmel clash." By the time the show wrapped, the clip had already been viewed 2 million times. Within an hour, it hit every platform: TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. The hashtags multiplied. #Stallone walkout. #late night clash. #you went too far. Fans rallied instantly. Edits surfaced with Rocky's theme, "Gonna Fly Now," synced perfectly to the moment Stallone stood up. The walkout became a slow-motion anthem. Someone captioned it. He didn't storm off, He rose up. Celebrities began chiming in. Chris Pratt tweeted, "Dignity doesn't yell, it walks out. Respect to the legend." Jamie Lee Curtis reposted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "This. Right here. This is what class looks like." Even actors from Stallone's past projects jumped in. Dolph Lundgren commented, "The man still punches harder with words than most do with fists." Within 3 hours, entertainment news sites were flooded with headlines. Sylvester Stallone walks out of Kimmel interview. He went too far. Viewers call out Kimmel's disrespect. Stallone turns late night into a masterclass in dignity. Jimmy's team, meanwhile, scrambled for damage control. Anonymous sources began leaking to blogs, claiming Stallone overreacted or took jokes too seriously. But it was too late. The tide had already turned. Clips from the interview were dissected like battle footage. Fans slowed down the moment Stallone's expression changed, timestamped the exact second his patience snapped. One viral post said, circling his clenched jaw, "This is when he decided to walk instead of fight." By morning, the studio's inbox was flooded. Thousands of emails, some furious, some praising, all demanding answers. Kimmel's name trended right below Stallone's, and not in a flattering way. Kimmel disrespect was brutal. "Imagine mocking a man who gave everything to cinema," one user wrote. "Rocky taught us to get up after every fall. Kimmel just taught us who never learned how to listen." Meanwhile, Stallone stayed silent. No statements, no interviews, no press spin, just quiet. And that silence spoke louder than any PR response ever could. But behind the scenes, his team knew the power of that restraint. His publicist called him the next morning. "You're everywhere," she said breathlessly. "Do you want to say something? Maybe issue a statement?" Stallone simply replied, "No. Let them talk. The truth doesn't need a press release." He hung up. Outside, the world was already talking for him. By noon, morning shows replayed the footage on loop. One anchor on Good Morning America called it a rare moment of unscripted honesty. Another on Entertainment Tonight said, "It's the kind of television moment you can't fake. Raw, human, uncomfortable, and real." Clips of the audience's reaction began circulating too. Viewers noticed how, in the final seconds before Stallone walked off, a woman in the front row stood and started clapping. A man followed, then another. That slow rise, that ripple of spontaneous respect, became its own symbol. "People don't stand for ego," one tweet read. "They stand for integrity." By evening, Stallone's name was everywhere. The algorithm couldn't escape it. YouTube was flooded with titles. "The Night Stallone Walked Out, Full Breakdown." "Why Stallone Won the Internet." Kimmel's career-denting interview, a lesson in respect. Reaction videos popped up from creators around the globe. Some laughed, some analyzed, others sat in quiet awe. "Look at his body language," one commentator said. "He didn't need to shout. He just stood, and the whole world felt it." Meanwhile, Jimmy's team finally issued a statement late that night. Jimmy Kimmel Live. Values open dialogue and humor. "We regret any misunderstanding during last night's show. It was safe, polished, empty, and fans saw right through it." Underneath the post, the replies flooded in. "Too late. Respect goes both ways. Maybe next time, don't joke about a man's legacy." By midnight, Stallone finally broke his silence, but not with an interview, not with a statement, not even with a press conference. He posted a single photo on Instagram, a still frame from the show, him standing, the spotlight cutting across his face, his chair empty behind him. The caption read, "Sometimes walking away says more than words ever could." Within 10 minutes, it had 500,000 likes. By sunrise, 5 million. The comment section was a wall of support. He didn't walk out, he walked up. "Real strength is quiet. You taught us all something last night, Sly." Even boxers, veterans, and motivational speakers shared the post. The moment had transcended celebrity. It had become something else, a metaphor for self-respect, for dignity under fire. Meanwhile, late-night producers across Hollywood watched in silence, suddenly aware that what happened that night wasn't just viral. it was revelatory. Because what everyone witnessed wasn't an actor losing his temper. It was a man reclaiming his worth. And for the first time in years, late-night television didn't look powerful. It looked small. By sunrise, the Stallone walkout wasn't just a trending clip, it was a cultural earthquake. Television networks, morning radio shows, film podcasts, and think pieces from both coasts were dissecting every frame of that late-night showdown. The footage replayed endlessly, Jimmy Kimmel leaning forward with a smirk. The moment he went one jab too far, Stallone's steady rise from the chair, the weight in his eyes before he walked away. It wasn't just replayed, it was studied. Analysts slowed the footage down to milliseconds, like historians parsing an artifact from a turning point in pop culture. CNN called it a moment that reminded Hollywood what respect looks like. Rolling Stone ran with a headline, "When Stallone stood up, late night sat down." Every outlet had an angle. Some called it bravery, others defiance. But all agreed, it was authentic. For once, the word viral didn't cheapen the meaning. In Los Angeles, inside a Beverly Hills gym, Stallone trained alone the next morning. The punching bag swung rhythmically, his gloves cracking against leather with methodical force. Each hit was slow, deliberate, not anger, just rhythm. A producer friend walked in, holding his phone, shaking his head with a smile. "Sly," he said, "you broke the internet. I can't even scroll without seeing your face." Kimmel's getting roasted. Stallone grunted, breathing steadily through his punches. Wasn't about roasting anyone, he said between swings. Was about self-respect. The friend chuckled. "Yeah, well, the public seems to agree. You just made every man over 40 their new hero again." Stallone cracked a faint smile. "Not trying to be anyone's hero," he replied, taking off his gloves. "Just tired of pretending disrespect is entertainment." That afternoon, a press conference for his upcoming film was quietly postponed. Reporters didn't want to ask about the movie anymore. They wanted that quote, that moment, that stay down. Studios called his team, suggesting he let the noise die down. But there was no stopping it now. It wasn't controversy, it was clarity. That night, Jimmy Kimmel opened his next show trying to laugh it off. The studio lights felt hotter than usual. His grin looked tighter. The jokes came slower. "Well, folks," he began, "I think I made the news. Apparently, I'm the new Apollo Creed, and Stallone knocked me out live on TV." The audience chuckled, but the laughter was thin, uneasy. There was a fracture there, something no amount of cue cards could fix. "Look," Jimmy continued, "it was just jokes. I love Sly. He's a legend. No hard feelings. Maybe next time we'll stick to talking about the movie." But viewers weren't buying it. Comments on the show's YouTube upload were relentless. Damage control. He's only sorry the cameras caught it. Late night lost its soul years ago. The Kimmel brand, built on sarcasm and swagger, suddenly looked brittle. Meanwhile, across town, Stallone sat in a quiet restaurant corner booth with his daughters. No entourage, no cameras, just family. A server hesitated as she approached, clearly starstruck. "Mr. Stallone, I just wanted to say, last night, that was powerful. My dad cried watching it." Stallone smiled kindly, gesturing for her to relax. "Tell your dad thank you. Sometimes standing up isn't about anger. It's about knowing when to stop sitting down." She nodded, tears welling up. "My dad said that was the first time he's seen a man handle disrespect without shouting." Stallone just nodded, quietly moved. He didn't need applause. He never had. By Friday, op-eds poured in from across the media spectrum. The New Yorker, Stallone reminds us what authenticity feels like in a culture addicted to irony. Variety. Audiences are starving for sincerity. Stallone gave them a meal. GQ. The Last Gentleman of Hollywood just schooled late-night television. It wasn't about movies anymore. It was about character. Even other hosts began commenting subtly, some with humor, others with respect. Stephen Colbert joked, "I'm not saying I'd pick a fight with Stallone, but I'm also not saying I'd survive it." Others were more reflective. "We forget that guests on these couches are human," one veteran host said in an interview. "They've earned more than punchlines." Stallone just reminded us. Hollywood, always quick to move on, didn't this time. 3 days after the walkout, Stallone appeared unexpectedly on a small, independent podcast, Inside the Frame. It wasn't a network platform or a PR stunt. It was a quiet, honest conversation with a young filmmaker named Jonah Reyes, known for his deep-cut interviews about storytelling. The episode went live at midnight. Within hours, it exploded. Jonah began softly, "Mr. Stallone, people are calling what happened a moment of defiance. Was that your intent?" Stallone chuckled, low and weary. "Defiance? No, I wasn't trying to start anything. But sometimes silence gets mistaken for agreement. And I've stayed silent too long when people confuse mockery with wit." Jonah nodded. "Did it feel personal?" "No," Stallone said, his voice steady. "It felt cultural. We've built this idea that tearing others down is clever. That humor means superiority. But I think people are tired of it. They want heart again. They want meaning." There was a long pause. Jonah leaned forward. "Do you think the industry will change because of this?" Stallone smiled faintly. "Probably not. But maybe a few people watching will. And that's enough for me." That moment, simple, unguarded, sincere, went more viral than the walkout itself. Clips from the podcast flooded TikTok. Sometimes silence gets mistaken for agreement. It became a quote, a mantra, a modern proverb. In the following week, fans began revisiting his old films, Rocky, First Blood, Creed. Sales surged. Streaming platforms reported spikes in Stallone titles. But it wasn't nostalgia driving it. It was rediscovery. People weren't rewatching the movies for the fights or explosions. They were watching them for the heart. For the first time in decades, the man who wrote about underdogs wasn't being mocked for living it. He was being honored for embodying it. And while late-night hosts tried to pivot to lighter topics, the shadow of that night still lingered. Viewers began noticing how differently guests were treated. More care, more space, fewer gotcha jokes. A small but noticeable shift. The entertainment world had been reminded. Humility might not trend forever, but disrespect will never age well. By the end of that week, Time magazine featured Stallone on its digital cover. The Last Fighter, Why Stallone's Walkout Hit Harder Than Any Movie Punch. The subheadline read, "When a legend refuses to play the game, the world pays attention." Inside, the writer concluded, Stallone didn't walk away from an interview. He walked into history and reminded us that grace under pressure is still the most powerful performance of all. As the sun set over Los Angeles that evening, Stallone stood on his balcony overlooking the city. The same skyline that had once been his proving ground now glowed below him like a film reel of memories. He didn't check social media. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about legacy, image, or headlines. He was thinking about something simpler. Dignity. It doesn't come from applause. It doesn't come from fame. It comes from knowing when to walk and why. And that night, the world had finally remembered. It was the kind of week that rewrites reputations. By Sunday night, the clip had crossed 200 million views across platforms, dissected by analysts, stitched into reaction videos, and remixed into motivational edits with orchestral music swelling behind Stallone's measured rise from his chair. Every outlet, from TMZ to the Washington Post, had covered it. It wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a symbol. People didn't say, "Did you see the Stallone interview?" anymore. They said, "Did you see the moment?" Because that's what it became, a moment. A single line in the story of modern entertainment, when dignity stood taller than the joke. When a man who'd built his name on fighting back did something even stronger. He walked away. And yet, in the days that followed, Stallone didn't bask in the spotlight. He avoided interviews, red carpets, even the phone calls from networks suddenly desperate to book him again. He spent his mornings walking his dog near Griffith Park, ball cap pulled low, smiling quietly when strangers approached him with words like respect and thank you. The irony wasn't lost on him. For a man who had spent his life crafting characters about perseverance, the moment that defined him now came not from a punch, but from restraint. Meanwhile, Hollywood had begun its own quiet reckoning. Writers' rooms across late-night television whispered about what happened. Producers, who once encouraged edgy humor to boost ratings, started pulling hosts aside, reminding them to ease off on personal digs. There was a memo circulating internally through networks, unofficial, but clear. It said, "We're not in the business of humiliation. Remember why people tune in. Connection, not cruelty." For the first time in years, the tone of late night was shifting. It wasn't just jokes anymore. It was awareness. And all of it traced back to one man, one night, one moment that stripped away the glossy veneer of showbiz and exposed something raw underneath. But Stallone wasn't thinking about any of that. That weekend, he finally agreed to appear on one show, CBS Sunday Morning. A quieter format. No live audience. No snarky banter. Just an intimate sit-down interview filmed in a softly lit studio, the walls lined with still from his films. The interviewer, an older journalist named Martin Keene, began gently. "Sylvester, you've been in this business for over 5 decades. You've seen everything. Praise, mockery, reinvention. But what happened this week, it feels like something different. Did you expect that reaction?" Stallone shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I didn't plan anything. I didn't go there looking for drama. I went to talk about my movie. But when someone tries to turn your life's work into a punchline, you've got 2 choices. You either laugh along, or you stand up. I chose to stand." He nodded. "Do you think late-night television has lost touch with what it used to be?" Stallone sighed softly, glancing down for a moment. Late night used to celebrate people. It used to have class. Carson, Letterman, they teased you, but they respected you. Somewhere along the line, it became about scoring points, not sharing moments. And I think audiences are tired of that. I know I am. The interviewer leaned forward slightly. "So when you walked out, what was going through your head?" Stallone's eyes softened. "Honestly, nothing poetic. I just knew it was time. I've fought a lot of battles in my life, some physical, most invisible. But you reach a point where you realize not every fight deserves your fists. Some deserve your silence. Some deserve your exit." There was a long pause. Keene didn't fill it. The moment was enough. That clip, just that 30-second answer, became the most replayed part of the interview. It made its way across every feed, every country, every platform. Not every fight deserves your fists. Some deserve your silence. People quoted it on posters, shared it on Instagram stories, printed it on gym walls. The line became a mantra, not just for fans of Stallone, but for anyone who'd ever had to choose between anger and grace. And in a world addicted to outrage, grace felt revolutionary. Across Los Angeles, inside a cramped writer's room, a young comedian watched that interview between script revisions. He leaned back in his chair and whispered, "Maybe the old man's right." He wasn't alone. Hosts started changing their tone, not out of fear, but respect. Guests were treated with more patience, more authenticity. The jokes softened, the conversations deepened. It wasn't that late night lost its edge, it found its soul again. The change wasn't overnight, but it was noticeable. Interviews that once ended in awkward laughter now ended with applause, the kind that came from genuine connection, not Ken studio signs. One entertainment columnist summed it up best in an op-ed titled "The Night Dignity Made a Comeback." When Stallone stood, he didn't just leave a studio. He left behind an era that confused mockery for wit. In doing so, he gave the industry a mirror, and it didn't like what it saw. A week later, Stallone received a handwritten letter. No return address, just a single line scrawled on fine paper. "Thank you for reminding us that being strong isn't about fighting. It's about knowing when to stop." He smiled faintly and slipped it into the drawer of his desk beside an old, framed photo of the Rocky set. Him in worn gloves, sweat dripping, eyes fierce but hopeful. It reminded him of something he told his daughters years ago. "You don't win every round by hitting back. Sometimes you win by walking away." That line had been advice then. Now it was prophecy. Back in the entertainment world, Jimmy Kimmel stayed silent for days before finally addressing it head-on during an opening monologue. His tone was softer this time. No smirk, no irony. "Last week, something happened on this show that got a lot of attention," he began. "And I've had some time to think about it. I made jokes that weren't fair. I crossed a line. And Sylvester Stallone, if you're watching, I respect what you did. You handled it better than I did. The audience applauded quietly, sincerely. It wasn't damage control this time. It was humility. The kind Stallone had modeled without saying a word. And that was the real victory. Not that one man humbled another, but that one moment humbled an industry. Months later, Stallone sat in his home office, sunlight filtering through the blinds, as an assistant read out media nominations for the upcoming year. His documentary, Heart of the Fighter, was being shortlisted for awards, not for its action, but its honesty. The same word that had followed him since that night. Honesty. He smiled, waved her off, and looked out the window toward the Los Angeles skyline, glittering, proud, and somehow smaller than it used to feel. I didn't walk out to make history, he murmured quietly to himself. I just walked out to make a point. And that point had echoed far beyond any stage or screen. It had become part of his legend. Because legends aren't built on applause, they are built on conviction. The clip of that walkout still plays on screens, years later. Film students analyze it in media ethics classes. Motivational speakers use it to talk about emotional intelligence. And every time it reappears online, someone inevitably comments the same thing beneath it. He didn't lose his temper. He found his dignity. The lights of the city shimmered far below as Stallone leaned back in his chair, the faint sound of Gonna Fly now playing from an old record player in the corner. For the first time in a long time, he smiled, not the smile of a movie star, but of a man who knew he'd said everything that mattered without saying much at all. He reached for a pen, scribbled something on a piece of paper, and tucked it beside the letter in his drawer. It read, "Respect doesn't retire." And that's how it ended, not with applause, not with outrage, but with peace. Because sometimes, walking away isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a legacy.